Hello and welcome back to Honor of Kings, season number 3, here at Hanging on His Words this season. My name's Ken Heidebrecht, and joining me today, as always, is the scripture savant himself, Sean Griffin.
Hey, Ken. What's up, brother? It's good to be back here doing this again with you. I'm excited to pick up the Testament of Job, and it's always fun doing this show with you, brother.
Yes, absolutely, man. It's a blast, and I know that people are enjoying it as well, for the most part, I think. The reviews have been pretty good thus far, and we are 3 seasons deep into doing this type of thing. So far, so good, brother. For those of you who are new to this show, I like to kind of just do a quick little, not a recap, but I'd like to tell you what this show is really all about. So Sean and I, we've been buddies and friends for years now, and we love the scriptures. And in our adventures of going through the scriptures, we discovered that there are more books to the Bible. There are more books out there that are not in our Western Protestant canon of 66. And so we decided, well, let's look into some of these books that have been removed over the years and read them, study them, and see why they were removed and if they should have been removed. And so we've done several books, and the book that we're covering tonight is actually a very interesting one. If you haven't watched the first episode of this Honor of Kings season, or not the first episode, sorry, the first episode for this Testament of Job that we're covering on Honor of Kings, we are doing the Testament of Job. And so I highly recommend that you watch that first episode, and just to kind of catch up to where we're at right now. We're going to be jumping into chapter 4 of this book. It's an interesting little book that actually expounds a little bit more on some of the circumstances and scenarios that we find if we read the canon book of Job. So don't get that confused. There's a Testament of Job that we're doing tonight, and then we're pairing it kind of with or against the canonized book of Job. And so it's interesting. And Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but we discovered when we did the comparison between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint version of the book of Job that there's actually an interesting little end statement at the end of that book in the Septuagint version that talks about possibly the very book that we're talking about tonight. Am I right about
that? Say that one more time. Sorry, I was looking at the chat.
No, that's okay. In the Septuagint that we went through when we were comparing the Masoretic text versus the Septuagint of the book of Job, we discovered at the very end of the Septuagint book of Job that there is a very interesting and conspicuous chapter that just seems to be missing out of the Masoretic text version that implies or seems to imply that there is another writing that talks about the life of Job and the circumstances that he had to deal with.
Yeah, it's here on screen in the Septuagint. It's at the top of chapter 42, verse 17, that speaking of Job, this man is described in the Syriac book as living in the land of Aussies. That translates to the land of Uz for most translations.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. So when we actually look into this book, which we are doing tonight, we're discovering some really interesting things about Job and his life, and I guess just his role, not just biblically, but in the ancient world, I guess, how he was a king, he was a priest, we discovered, characteristics that the Masoretic text doesn't really reveal to us in the book of Job, the canonized version of the book of Job. So very fascinating stuff. I think we plan on covering the entirety of this book, Sean. Is that correct? Even though it's probably going to take us probably more than another 2 or 3 episodes at this pace, but I think it's going to be worth it because it's a very fascinating read.
Yeah, I think this particular book has like 12 chapters, so we should be able to knock out 3 or 4 per episode and get through it. It's got so much to say, and we kind of teased last week that last week was pretty fascinating, but this week will be more fascinating.
Yeah.
So there's lots to talk about this week.
There is, and just so people realize, I mean, when I say like we've discovered that there are more books, that sometimes they're called the Apocrypha. Sean, that's kind of we've discovered that word is rather demeaning, right? We're heterodoxic in the way that we kind of look at that type of nomenclature that goes with the word Apocrypha, right?
Yeah,
it's men who have grouped what they think is the scriptures, or what they consider to be the scriptures, and kind of just lambasted it with a title called the Apocrypha. And a lot of people don't even realize the fact that that word, it's not a very nice word. It's a biased word, right?
Yeah, and last week we talked about the origination of that idea through the Roman Catholic Church. Now that the first century Pharisees, they already deemed certain books that they told people not to read these books or you'll lose your salvation. And
Right.
so some of those books, like most people are familiar with, like the Book of Jubilees or Book of Enoch, because they've been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they've been, they're easy to venerate with their theology and their prophecies. But around the 5th century, 496 AD, as I have on screen here, we had Pope Gelasius I. He was trying to make this like this is after the Council of Nicaea, about 100 years or more. So he's just fed up. At least from what I read, he was fed up with all the different books and different groups. And I'm not a Roman Catholic by any means, guys. We we are, at least that's kind of what Ken was mentioning with his seminary word being a heterodox, meaning that you're not in line with what the traditional mainstream Catholic Church teaches, because that would be orthodox, right? That would be in line with what they teach in their doctrine. But to be outside of that there was lots of groups outside of that: Armenians, the Syriac communities from Turkey, and lots of in the Eastern Orthodox groups like the Ethiopians. A lot of them were outside of what the Catholic Church wanted. So this Pope Gelasius, through this move of enforcement, trying to like bully people, he was like, nah, look, I'm just going to create a canon. We're going to call these other books apocryphal, say that they're spurious, meaning people should look at them with a suspicious eye. He basically, in modern terms, he said all these other books are sus, right? And so that immediately started putting a bad label on a whole bunch of different books that he labeled the Testaments. And this book, Testament of Job, was lumped into that group of books.
Yeah, that's correct.
So this is just one dude making this claim, and because he had, he was the Pope at that time, people gave him authority, and that's why it kind of stuck, and people then started calling books apocryphal if it wasn't in the Catholic canon.
Yeah, it's interesting what happens when you allow, what people think is an authority to control and to put names and titles on something over the laity, right? And it's just like, when you peel apart that word and you actually look at the text themselves, it's like, what is going on here? And for those of you who are new, Sean and I have discovered that there are some fascinating little things that I guess were worth hiding and removing from people's knowledge base over the centuries due to their own agendas and their own twists on what they want people to believe with regards to the scriptures and the Messiah and his priesthood. And so, yeah, I guess we'll just jump right in. Like I said, we're hitting up chapter 4, and that's where we left off from last episode. And Sean, do you want me to read? Do you want to read?
Go ahead. You can start.
Okay. All right. So this is Job talking. And my children, after having taken charge of the service, took their meals each day along with their 3 sisters, beginning with the older brother, and made a feast. And I rose in the morning and offered as sin offering for them 50 rams and 19 sheep, and what remained as a residue was consecrated to the poor. And I said to them, take these as residue and pray for my children. Perchance my sons have sinned before the Lord, speaking in haughtiness of spirit. We are children of this rich man. Ours are all these goods. Why should we be servants of the poor? And speaking this in a haughty spirit, they may have provoked the anger of God, for overbearing pride is an abomination before the Lord. So I brought oxen as offerings to the priest at the altar, saying, may my children never think evil towards God in their hearts. While I lived in this manner, the seducer could not bear to see the good I did, and he demanded the warfare of God against me. And he came upon me cruelly. First, he burnt up the large number of sheep, then the camels, then he burnt up the cattle and all my herds. Or they were captured not only by enemies, but also by such as had received benefits from me. And the shepherds came and announced that to me. But when I heard it, I gave praise to God and did not blaspheme. And when the seducer learned of my fortitude, he plotted new things against me. He disguised himself as king of Persia and besieged my city. And after he had led off all that were therein, he spoke to them in malice, saying in boastful language, this man Job, who has obtained all the goods of the earth and left nothing for others, he has destroyed and torn down the temple of God. Therefore, shall I repay to him what he has done to the house of the great God? Now come with me, and we shall pillage all that is left in his house. And they answered and said to him, He has 7 sons and 3 daughters. Take caution, they may flee into other lands, and they may become our tyrants, and then come over us with force and kill us. And he said, Be not at all afraid. His flocks and his wealth have I destroyed by fire, and the rest have I captured. And behold, his children shall I kill. And having spoken this, he went and threw the house upon my children and killed them. And my fellow citizens, seeing that what was said by him had become true, came and pursued me and robbed me of all that was in my house. And I saw with my own eyes the pillage of my house. And men without culture and without honor sat at my table and on my couches, and I could not forcefully protest against them. For I was exhausted like a woman with her loins let loose from multitude of pains, remembering chiefly that this warfare had been predicted to me by the Lord through his angel. And I became like one who, when seeing the rough sea and the adverse winds, while the lading of the vessel in mid-ocean is too heavy, cast the burden into the sea, saying, I wish to destroy all this only in order to come safely into the city so that I may take as profit the rescued ship and the best of my things. Thus did I manage my own affairs. But there came another messenger and announced to me the ruin of my own children, and I was shaken with terror. And I tore my clothes and said, The Lord has given and the Lord has taken. As it is deemed best to the Lord, it has come to be. May the name of the Lord be blessed. All right.
Wow.
Lots going on there, brother.
Yeah, it's an absolute calamity. Job is getting hit. Like he made war in the first 3 chapters against Satan by tearing down that idol's temple, and then now this is Satan's response.
Yes, exactly. And it's just interesting the way that, I guess, the seducer or the evil one, right? 2 monikers that Job has decided to use for Satan. It just his the way that he kind of frames the argument, like it's just like, well, this guy killed, he destroyed the temple of God, right? Like all this calamity has come upon him because of these evil deeds that he's done, and so he's just trying to convince him that like this is what he's done and it's evil when it's referring to him, right? And it's this whole temple was in worship of him, and just his ability to seduce and get people to think that that's a wrong thing, right? It's just really it's crazy.
Well, so this temple, did it give us the name of this temple?
I don't think it gave it the name, but it just said that the idol of Satan, I think if I recall correctly, was what was being worshipped in the temple there.
Yeah, that makes me think of because I've been breaking down the history of the Greeks and the being a Genesis 10 nation, the Greeks coming out right out the gate, and that they actually worshipped Pluto. And then they brought, like I had showed from one of my other Investigative Babylon series, that showed that even Josephus was talking about how the priests of Pluto brought the idols of Pluto to the building of the Tower of Babel. And so I think, Ken, the reason I say that, I think that you might agree with me in this timeline of the testament of Job's life, this is after the Tower of Babel.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think we're going to see Pluto mentioned later on in these chapters. And so I just couldn't remember. And I was trying to make sure that this idol of Satan, I wonder if that was just generic moniker or if it was actually one of the, like that trinity of pantheon of gods that's worshipped by the Greeks. Because it was Zeus, Apollo, and Hades. And Hades also was called Pluto.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's where I'm wondering if the idol that he destroyed was an idol to Zeus, or what which in that region, I guess it would have been translated to most likely Baal or one of the Mesopotamian names for Baal. So I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm just not Baal. But the serpent god, and I can't remember his name right now. But basically, because they did have different idols for the different of the 3 top main gods. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like we read in Bel and the dragon represented the dragon, and then the statue of Baal represented Baal, right? So that was in Babylon that Daniel had to deal with. So anyway, I'm sorry about not meaning to derail, just trying to figure out, I couldn't remember from last week if that was, if they actually named the idol that Job destroyed.
I don't think. I can go back real quick and take a quick look, but I'm pretty sure it was just an idol or a temple with an idol of Satan, and I think that's what it was. But
Which the winged serpent has been worshipped throughout all cultures, like throughout time. It's wild. I mean, even in the South America and Middle America cultures, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and things like that. So and of course in Japanese and Chinese cultures, they worship the winged serpent, the flying dragon. So it's just amazing. Like, I wonder what this temple actually looked like. But clearly, whether it was Pluto or whether it was Satan himself as a dragon serpent, like Satan is taking it personally. Now he's coming after Job's business, his herd, his livestock. And what I thought was sad is, let me see, what verse was this? What it said here in verse 9. And some of the people that took some of his herds were people that he had done business with and had benefited from him.
I know, his own people that he was ruling over. Yeah,
that's
sad.
Rough.
Yeah, that would be really rough. Add insult to injury, literally, right?
Yeah. So what do you think it means, though, in verse 9, where it says he burnt up the large number of sheep and then the camels and the cattle?
I think it's just like what it says in Job, in the book of Job, where it talks about how fire essentially destroyed, all the cattle and everything that was listed off there. I just somehow, I mean, he sent fire down and destroyed it. I don't. Do you think there's like a double meaning there or something deeper?
No. I just didn't know. And I'm looking for that passage. I think it was in Job 1, right?
Yeah.
So he goes out, edge of the sword, killed the sword. I just gave to tell you, great wind and
16.
Yeah, here I'll put it up for everyone to look at as well. So this is in Job, the canonized text of Job. While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." So this brings up a big question, right? It's not big enough. One second. It brings up a big question. The fire of God. Is this Yahweh?
Now that's the Masoretic version, right?
That's right.
The Septuagint says, it just says that fire has fallen from heaven and burnt up the sheep.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it makes me wonder. I mean, we know that. Okay, this is interesting because this would be like a pretty big thing, right, for Satan himself to actually throw down fire and destroy some animals.
Yeah.
I mean, can you think?
I know you're paralleling or looking, foreshadowing, kind of like a revelation, like.
No, I'm not.
Are you?
Oh yeah,
no?
you're talking about the beast, the second beast. No,
yeah.
No, I'm just thinking in general. Like, have we ever seen Satan do anything like this in the canon? This is the canon, but I'm saying, like, other than the book of Job, have we seen him do anything like this? I think this is wild, personally.
Yeah, no, it is. I don't.
Yeah,
my memory doesn't recall any other scripture in the canon or other text alike that would reveal something like that. But I mean, Elijah had an interesting thing, right? That was Yahweh who set the fire there.
Right. That's why I think the Masoretic is misleading to say it was the fire of God. Now, even if there was a translator that inserted the capital G and it's really just the fire of Elohim, which would mean the fire of the low gods, I could see that. But then again, you're like, how does that work? What does it look like? Like, was it a Vimana? Was it literally just Satan conjuring up with like magic the ability to throw fire from the sky above and burn up these cattle from an overhead bird's eye view? I don't know. Is it like the Eye of Sauron, but he's got laser beams? Like, what does this look like? You know what I mean? Anyway, I'm just fascinated by some of the language.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. You had touched on the timeline for this, right? And we both agree it's post Genesis 10, 11, right? That time frame after the flood.
After different languages that it came about.
Yeah, and this was actually one of the reservations I had with this text, Sean, was what we, in verse 12 here of Testament of Job, where it talks about how Satan disguised himself as king of Persia. I don't know if you recall my immediate knee-jerk response while we were testing this book, going through it, was like, okay, that doesn't line up, because the Persians, from my understanding of history, they came way later. So how could he be disguising himself as a king of a culture, of a people group that to my knowledge didn't come into fruition yet? They didn't even exist yet. So is this an anachronistic type of error in this book that kind of gives it the, I don't know about that? Or is it something else? And you had an interesting kind of rebut to that initial issue that I had with it. You want to bring that up? Do you remember it?
Or do you just mean the fact that modern translators would give it a name people recognize from that region?
Yeah, or
Like
just
similar like Josephus does with Pluto, with mentioning Pluto, because that was actually a Roman adaptation of a name given to Hades, what the Greeks called Hades.
mhm.
So therefore, when a new scribe comes along and they're translating a book, they'd be like, okay, people aren't going to know what this is because they're trying to get that book to a different people group. So then they adopt the name that was given to that god later in time so that the readers in that century understand who's being referenced.
Right. And so is
But
this what we're
that's,
seeing here with the king of Persia? Like, is
yeah,
this
possible. It's possible. The other thing is that I know that most historians think that the Persian Empire didn't come about until approximately the 8th or 9th century BC. So that's probably like during the days of Jeroboam, just right after Solomon.
yeah,
But that's what they claim. Now,
right.
this, same thing with like the Greek people will say the Greeks didn't come along till 1000 BC, but yet if you look at the timeline of Genesis and the names involved and the people of Javan and other peoples, like apparently they're around for a lot much earlier than that. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like trying to figure out what does the secular history claim from their archaeological speculations, and that's a lot of people don't realize this, Ken, but that's truly all it is with archaeology. Like they find stuff in the dirt and then they assume based on certain indicators that it came from different timelines, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I understand, the Persian Empire is assumed to have originated in the 9th century BC in the area of Iran. I think they said it used to be called Persis. And so I don't know if that was the original name and then the translators came along and just said, oh, well, this is actually the king of Persia, because people don't know what Persis is.
Yeah.
But ultimately, yeah, it's some people could look at this and say this is an anachronistic error.
Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to bring that up because, for those who are studious and care about the inconsistencies and the possible incongruences that we could discover in texts like this that we're doing here, that would be one of them. And that was one of mine, right? And so I think it's possible that, again, we don't have the actual Syriac, the Greek texts, the Coptic. We don't have that to kind of use a concordance with, right? We don't have any way to check what those words are, how they translate out properly. And to what you said, this could be translated into English based off of the text that they found, but during the time that it was written, it could have been, Persia could have been referring to something earlier back, but they wanted to
Right.
use the word Persia as a way to, for people to be like, oh, okay, they're talking about this people group, but it could have been earlier back, right? The Medes went even further back than the Persians.
Right.
And so, and they kind of conglomerate them too sometimes, right? And when we see the king of Persia, there's many, many kings of Persia, right? They're...
Well, I was going to say that it doesn't, as far as the text, it doesn't say the king of Persia, it says a king of Persia.
Yeah.
So that can be, again, it could be, if Persia is just a region in Iran, well, just like we see in Job's region in Edom, there's multiple kings,
Right.
Of different city states, basically. So this could be the same idea that it's the region of Persia located in what we would call Iran today, and within that large region, there were because that's a huge region, by the way. There's multiple kings with and one of the kings as a king of Persia came and besieged. To me, and that's the interesting part. This goes into more concepts of who's doing this. Okay, so the reason I'm asking this, Ken, is because like every other time in Scripture, we see Satan tricks other people to do things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like in the garden, he tricks Eve and Adam to take the bite themselves. He doesn't force an apple into their mouth. And in other places, he tries to trick people to do things on their own through deception. He rarely like gets involved himself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm wondering about this story is that, as it quickly tells us stuff, both in the canonized version and also the Testament of Job, it quickly tells you how Satan attacked Job, and it doesn't really give a lot of details. That's why I was asking about what does it look like to have fire come down? Is that literally Satan hovering in the air and gathering fire in some way, in some sort of incantation of magic, and throwing it down? Or is it more practical, like just like he convinced these people that were allegiant to Persian forces to come and maraud Job? Maybe he had some way to get other people to attack
Set fire.
Job's lands
Yeah.
with fire. You know what I mean? So yeah, I don't know if that means he convinced a group of archers from a distance to lob fiery arrows like artillery and burned up the whole fields and the cattle and everything. I don't know what that looks like. Is all I'm saying. It just seems to like glaze over and just quickly talk about it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's interesting without going into great detail about stuff that we've already talked about in great depth in past episodes with regards to like angels and their capabilities, right? I mean, they can set things on fire, right? They can kill 185,000 men like rotting flesh in their armor standing there overnight type thing without, any issues. So it's like for them to just create a large fire to destroy something, to me that's not out of the realm of what their capabilities are. It
I
is interesting
agree,
though.
but would he be held accountable? I agree with you, but would he be held accountable?
Not if
Like
he gets permission, right? Because he got permission from Yahweh to do everything except for touching him, right? And then he goes
that's
back
true.
the second time and says, "All right, now I want to touch him." And Yahweh's like, "All
That's
right,
true.
you can touch him, but don't kill him."
That's a good point. Yeah, I
So,
forgot about that. Yeah. Okay.
yeah. Um, we can move on from that, Sean. But I just find it interesting. I mean, as you were saying, like he's a seducer, a beguiler. He gets people, he cons them into doing something without actually participating himself necessarily. In verse 14, where it says, "This man Job, who has obtained all the goods of the earth and left nothing for others." I mean, what did we read prior to that and all the in chapters prior to that? What did he do with all the goods? Because he
He
was obedient to the Father, right? Because he obeyed Torah, he loved his neighbor. He cared about the orphan. He considered the widow and those people that were disenfranchised and whatnot. I mean, he did all those things amazingly. He did it correctly. And so we
yeah.
have Satan being like, no, he did opposite. He didn't care about anything. He cared only about himself, right? So he's trying to
Yeah.
muster this group of people against them using, lies
Right.
essentially to start
Because
this
it
thing off.
what like Yeshua tells us, Satan speaks, he speaks lies. I mean, it's his native tongue. So he's definitely lying to these people and rallying them up towards injustice, which I think is hilarious. He's creating covetousness within the people that attack Job by telling him he's got all this stuff, you
Yeah.
don't, and he's hoarding it. He's being greedy with it. When that's actually, it is a lie, like you're saying, it's the complete opposite. In fact, his friends that show up in a few chapters here, they acknowledge that he had sent all these wonderful things to all the peoples and all the lands, and that he was a huge, charitable person. And so it's just, it's sad that Satan just lies to people. This is the root of communism. This is what I said
Yeah.
in my other series, that communism is the religion of Babylon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's a great series. um,
Thanks, bro.
yeah, really, really good. Definitely recommend people check that out over at your Kingdom Cast channel for sure. Sean, right at the beginning there, I mean, we have chapter 1, right, of the book of Job here. Essentially, we have Job's children meeting every day, making feasts, and he's
Okay.
essentially worrying about the fact that they could eventually be full of haughtiness of spirit and not, be grateful anymore to the point where they might want to oppress the poor or whatnot. So he's essentially just doing these sacrifices or giving them to a priest, right? He's providing the priest with the means to do these sacrifices to kind of atone for any possible sin that they may have through their pride, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that lines up perfectly with Job 1, where we see Job doing that, caring about his children to the point where he's going to do sacrifices or provide the sacrifice for the priest to do that. And that lines up great. Now, do you see any discrepancies with what is sacrificed and how much is sacrificed in the Testament of Job compared to what the Septuagint version of Job says in chapter 1 when it comes to the sacrifice? It seems to be a little bit different from what I can
Yeah.
tell, but I don't, is
Yeah.
that a
Yeah. Let me see here. He offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. Um, I don't, does it say the actual number in the canon? Because we're looking at the canon. Um, I don't remember it saying the
or even the
number.
sin offering? He says he gives he gives one thing for a sin offering, doesn't he? Take a quick look here.
I don't remember. Perhaps they may have sinned. Yeah, so he's definitely making an atonement for them. But he tells in verse 2 that he offers as sin offerings for them 50 rams, 19 sheep. What remained as residue is consecrated to the poor, which I think is wonderful. That's also Torah. But yeah, it doesn't really say in Job 1 how much he offered, but it mentions burnt offerings in
Yeah,
Job
it's
chapter 1:5.
yeah 1:5 where it says right at the latter half or the middle, and one calf for a sin offering for their souls.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just to me it's like it seems like things might be slightly off, and that's we encountered that actually in chapters prior to this about how it seems like even just the amount of cattle and other livestock that he possessed kind of is slightly different in terms of the numbers that it espouses. So
Right.
I'm not sure.
There's, like we talked about last week, there's a couple places in here where the numbers are different. But here in the Septuagint in Job 1:5, it says, when the days of the banquet were completed, Job sent and purified them, having risen up in the morning and offered sacrifices for them according to their number, one calf for a sin offering for their souls. For Job said, lest peradventure my sons have thought evil in their minds against God. Then Job did continually. So it's weird that it mentions a burnt offering in the Masoretic, but the Septuagint mentions a sin offering and not a burnt offering.
Yeah.
Whereas we only get in the Testament of Job, it just mentions a sin offering. But there's a ton more animals than just one for them.
That's right.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Because 50 rams is a small herd, man. That's a lot. 50
that's
rams
huge.
and 19 sheep.
Yeah.
It's a lot. But I think it's fascinating because the residue was consecrated to the poor, meaning like, isn't the residue the part that, like in a sin offering, the priest would eat his share, but then the people would have a share. And I guess, so if there's leftovers, he and his children didn't eat of them. It was just given to the poor, which I think is amazing. So he's still, even in trying to cover his children's butts theologically, he still is using that as an opportunity to give to the poor. You know,
yeah,
I think
it's
this
amazing.
is pretty amazing.
It speaks to who he is. Yeah, he's an incredible man.
Yeah,
absolutely. Anything else in that chapter? Like, there's quite a bit more we could probably bring up, but
for sure. So I'm kind of sad by when I was reading through this, and it talked about in verse 22, I saw with my own eyes the pillage of my house, and men without culture and without honor sat at my table on my couches. I could not forced to protest them. And guys, this word forcefully protest, I want to be very transparent. If you're reading the Testament of Job on your own, I had to look up the word that they used in the ancient translation, and that word means to forcefully protest. And so, because there were some words in here from Old English that just people don't know what they are, and I wanted this to be an understandable read for us today. So that's one of the places where I had to change. It's the same concept. It's the same. It's just the definition of the Old English word that's used.
Remonstrate. That was the word, right?
Yeah. So I didn't want people to think that, we have some special translation here. No, this is just me trying to put it into a readable version for you while staying consistent with the word's definitions. But it's fascinating seeing that's mentioned here that Job is basically like it's like one of those horrible movies of like home invasion, where like the family's been like subdued or beaten up, and they just lay on the floor bleeding and hurting. And then they're watching the bad guys that have invaded their home just go around and just like sit their dirty feet on the couch and just like, laugh and make mockery and knock stuff over. And you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Drink out of their best glasses without, and it's just this is utter disgrace for Job. Like, this is pure embarrassment because this dude was a king. Thankfully, it doesn't say they did anything untoward toward his wife. So thankfully they didn't like abuse his wife or anything. But
yeah, that would just be terrible. I mean,
right, because he's watching this, he's watching people come into his home without his power. So like this is a rough moment where Job is being utterly humiliated. And some of this is by people he was formerly on good ground with, which is really sad.
Yeah. And he's still like technically on his throne, right? He's still king, right? Because as we're going to the next chapter, he's still chilling on his throne and Satan gets rid of him. But like, he's seeing all this just, from the perspective of right there at the apex of this kingdom. And it's like, it's just crazy. But what I find fascinating about this is that he keeps in mind that this is exactly what the angel told him would come about, right? When he initially had said, what happens if we deal with this temple of Satan? And he was like, well, if you do this, all these things are going to manifest, right? Satan's going to wage war against you. It's going to be brutal. So it's not like he had no idea what was coming, and he was a champ, and he's a champ for sure, but he kind of knew what was coming, which I don't know if that's necessarily a better thing, but he wasn't taken by surprise with a lot of the things that he had to endure and suffer through.
Yeah, there's two comments in the chat I just want to throw up here real quick. It has to do with one of them has to do with what you're saying. But first, Eric Rice just says, he's quoting Charlie Murphy, nice couch. which I think is hilarious if you remember the Dave Chappelle skit. So that I can envision someone just defaming his couch. But then also Miss Marcia says she's no Job, that she could not be patient at all. And that's, I think, speaking to what you're saying, is this idea of like, if he had not been warned by the angel that this was going to happen, he may have tried to defend himself in a way that, I don't know if anyone was. I mean, clearly the shepherds were still loyal to him. They're the ones that came back and told him what had happened and faithfully reported back to him, as opposed to just like taking their own share of the herd and running off. Right. So like they're at least seeming to be loyal to them. And we're going to read later how his wife, when he first married his wife, he talks about how she was escorted into his home by spearmen, soldiers, basically. Okay.
Yeah.
And this was part of her royalty, so like, did all of his house guards and all the people under his command that were soldiers, did they abandon him also? Did they try to fight these people that were taking over his land and his house, and he just ignored them because the angel told him this would happen? And he just was like, yeah, I'm just going to let this happen because I was warned, and I engaged in this willingly.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy to think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's weird because it seems like, all the normal things that would accompany a king, it seems like we're not getting those details as far as like what happened to his bodyguards, what happened to the people that protected his land and his house and his field and pastures. Were they somehow destroyed by the people that invaded?
The Persians. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, it's crazy. And Miss Marcia, we appreciate your transparent comment there, because you know what, I don't know, if I were Job initially, wandering about in my kingdom, and I saw this temple to Satan, and I'm told that this is going to befall you if you just decide to be righteous and act righteously towards getting rid of this thing out of your presence here, would I do it knowing you're going to lose all your family, your whole kingdom? You're going to be like on a dunghill for 7 years. You know what I mean? Just like all this craziness. Would I do that? I want to say yes, but it's so hard to know exactly how you would respond unless you're there in the moment, right? Unless you're that person. I'd like to say that one day I could get to that point of my faith and ability to be like, you know what, Satan, take it all and do whatever you must. And, the Lord give us and he takes away, blessed be his name. And that would be, my motto throughout the entirety of that, trial. I want to say I could do it. I don't know. I'm not sure I could.
Well, I will say this, back in chapter 1, I don't know either if I could either, Ken, to be honest with you. So, but I think that part of Job's motivation here is listed in chapter 1, where in verse 21 through 24, he is told that Satan will take away his children and inflict many evils upon him, that he's going to wrestle like an athlete and resist pain. We're actually going to see that callback. We're going to see that again in this episode. And then he also says, sure of your reward, overcoming trials and afflictions. But when you endure, this is the angel speaking the encouragement to Job about what's going to happen. I shall make your name renowned throughout all generations of the earth until the end of the world. And here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about Job.
Yeah.
In verse 24, he says, I shall restore to you all that you had. The double part of what you shall lose will be given to you, in order that you may know that God does not consider the person, but gives to each according who deserves the good. And also to you shall it be given, and you shall put on a crown of amaranth. So he is told what the bad that's going to happen, but he has said, if you endure through it, he's going to restore and double portion you. So that's encouraging to some degree.
Absolutely.
I don't, would it have still caused me to go through the same motions that he did? I don't know. I would definitely have to think about that.
Yeah, exactly.
It reminds me of that scene. Did you ever see the movie 300 in 2006?
Oh yeah.
So it reminds me of the scene where Lion, what's his name? Lion, what's the king's name? Lion.
Leonidas.
Leonidas. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
He's talking. He's in bed at night, and he's talking with his wife in their bedroom at night, and he's like, I don't know if I should go through with this. I don't know what this will mean, what this will do. And his wife basically says, you've got to. I'm paraphrasing, go watch the movie if you want, if you're adult 18 and over, because there's some male nudity.
Is this during or after the romp scene there, Sean?
Yeah, I think this is after that. But the point is, like, his wife ends up telling him, he's warning his wife about what he feels he needs to go do and whether he should do it or not, because he knows it's pretty much a death sentence. And his wife is like, you need to do this. So did he have any kind of conversation with his wife about what the angel told him? It doesn't tell us. It doesn't say that kind of, private pillow talk with Job and his wife, but yeah, it's hard to say if I'd make the same choice.
Yeah, totally, bro. Verse 20, where it says, "And having spoken in this manner, he went through the house upon my children and killed them." Now, the canonical version of the demise of his children says that I think it was a great wind, right? In verse, was it 19 of Job
Yeah.
1? Suddenly a great wind came on from the desert and caught the four corners of the house and destroyed it, and it killed the children. To me, that's interesting, Sean, because in this Testament of Job, it just says that he went through the house upon the children, but it says the great wind, right? And we're going to see a great wind present itself before Job in the next chapter as a hurricane, right? So getting back to what, can Satan, manifest fire from the way he wants and destroy things? Well, I guess he can come as a great wind to the point where he can knock down a house and kill people, and he can throw Job off his throne and do all these other things. So I just find that little bit of detail interesting.
Well, if that's the case, then people need to go into Oklahoma and just start rebuking tornadoes.
Yeah, no kidding.
Because boy, they're all over the place every year. So yeah, I mean, I hear you, man. This is like a specialized attack, and of course, I think it's fascinating that the ancient gods like Zeus and Apollo were associated with storms, like just like Baal was called a storm god, and they were associated to have the power of the storm and over wind and lightning, and specifically, so apparently with that Vajra that I talk about, that little weapon they had. So
yeah.
Is this a moment where he's using something like that? Or is there some other angelic power that he knows and some other way to manipulate the creation he knows that he's using? I don't know. It's fascinating.
Yeah, totally. All right. We're 45 minutes into this broadcast now, Sean, and we've only covered one chapter. I know the next chapter's not, short by any means, but it's not overly long. Do we want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Okay.
I don't think I saw anything else we want to cover, so I'll just jump into chapter 5.
Let's do it.
All right, guys. This is going to be chapter 5 of the Testament of Job. And it says, "And when Satan saw that he could not put me to despair, he went and asked my body of the Lord in order to inflict plague on me. For the evil one could not bear my patience. Then the Lord delivered me into his hands to use my body as he wanted. But he gave him no power over my soul. And he came to me as I was sitting on my throne, still mourning over my children. And he resembled a great hurricane, and turned over my throne, and threw me up on the ground. And I continued lying on the floor for 3 hours. And he smote me with a hard plague from the top of my head to the toes of my feet. And I left the city in great terror and woe, and sat down upon a dunghill, my body being worm-eaten. And I wet the earth with the moistness of my sore body, for matter flowed off my body, and many worms covered it. And when a single worm crept off my body, I put it back, saying, Remain on the spot where you have been placed until he who has sent you will order you elsewhere. Thus I endured for several years, 7 years, actually, that's a typo, 7 years, sitting on a dunghill outside of the city while being plague-stricken. And I saw with my own eyes my longed-for children carried by angels to heaven. My humbled wife, who had been brought to her bridal chamber in such great luxuriousness and with spearmen as bodyguards, I saw her do a water carrier's work like a slave in the house of a common man, in order to win some bread and bring it to me. And in my sore affliction, I said, Oh, that these braggart city rulers, whom I soul not, have thought to be equal with my shepherd dogs, should now employ my wife as servant. And after this, I took courage again. Yet afterwards they withheld even the bread, that it should only have her own nourishment. But she took it and divided it between herself and me, saying woefully, Woe to me! Immediately he may no longer feed on bread, and he cannot go to the market to ask bread of the bread sellers in order to bring it to me that he may eat. And when Satan learned this, he took the guise of a bread seller. And it was as if by chance that my wife met him and asked him for bread, thinking that it was that sort of man. But Satan said to her, Give me the value, and then take what you wish. Whereupon she answered, saying, Where shall I get money? Do you not know what misfortune happened to me? If you have pity, show it to me. If not, you shall see. And he replied, saying, If you did not deserve this misfortune, you would not have suffered all this. Oh, what a jerk. What a jerk.
Right.
Verse 20, right? It says, Now, if there is no silver piece in your hand, give me the hair of your head and take 3 loaves of bread for it, so that you may live on that for 3 days. Then she said to herself, What is the hair of my head in comparison with my starving husband? And so, after having pondered over the matter, she said to him, Rise and cut off my hair. Then he took a pair of scissors and took off the hair of her head in the presence of all, gave her 3 loaves of bread. Then she took them and brought them to me. and Satan behind her on the road, hiding himself as he walked and troubling her heart greatly. All right.
Thank you, bro. Brutal. Satan is just brutal. He's such a cunning little snake.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So there's so much in this chapter. You mentioned the hurricane already. What do you think? I mean, we've tried to figure out, like, what does this actually look like? What kind of powers does Satan actually possess?
Yeah,
This seems to be pretty personal because he's like in the throne room with him.
I know. Sean, obviously, when I started studying this book originally, it was around the time when I was putting together a presentation for just an explanation, expounding on Satan and his, characteristics and his powers and what type of angel he is. And I know the Bible doesn't necessarily even tell us what he is. We can speculate. I know that there's a lot of pondering around whether or not he's a cherubim or a watcher, right? I don't think First Enoch tells us, but from what I gather, Sean, in the Apocalypse of Abraham, based off of his description with the wings that he has, the amount of wings that he has, and from what I can tell with the seraphim, I think he's a seraph.
I was about to say, I've heard people made a strong case for him being a seraph.
Yeah. So yeah, and we don't really know what their full capabilities are, right? I mean, they might be just the living ones standing kind of guard in Yahweh's throne room, but at the same time, it's like we don't really know what they can fully display, right? I mean, I haven't seen any texts that show a seraph fully doing its thing, other than flying over to Isaiah and like putting a coal on his tongue, and I don't know, unless you have something else, but it's interesting because Satan is literally, from what I can tell, a very unique angel who gets to be around here in our environment on the earth. Whereas I don't think there's any other seraphim that have been able to leave the firmament. I don't know, I could be wrong, but it's interesting.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure the classification of the holy angels who clearly leave the firmament, come down amongst mankind, and if they're just generally lumped in this group of watchers, meaning angels that do travel to the, like, watcher may not be a classification of their ontology or their physical makeup, but it may be more of a classification of their purpose.
Yeah,
that they actually travel to the earth and back and forth, whereas other angels just stay in heaven. So I don't know. It's just could be, but I haven't seen anything to help you out. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and well, that's, you don't have to apologize. Just like I said, reading this text is very interesting. There's the things that he can do, right? He can present himself as like a hurricane, and he can, be a beggar man, or someone who's selling bread. He can transform himself into different things, and a lot of the other angels obviously can do that stuff too. But
yeah,
he just seems to be kind of unique.
And he can apparently just make plague pop up on a person, which is wild, which is consistent with, what we've talked about repeatedly from Jubilees chapter 10, with Satan is over these unclean spirits. And that's the thing that the unclean spirits were the thing that Noah was complaining about, how they were affecting his children with disease. And so, that's as interesting.
So this is the point where Satan, gives him the ultimate slap in the face, gets him off the throne. He, acquiesces to what is really going on, leaves the city, right, in terror, and just ends up spending 7 years. Can you imagine that, Sean? 7 years on a dunghill? On a dunghill, with your flesh rotting off of you, and you have worms covering your putrefied body for 7 years. Right. I mean, that's, I don't know. Like I said, if Job knew all those details prior, would he have signed up for that? I don't know. It's hard to say, right? But
yeah, it is hard to say.
That's pretty nasty.
And so hang on a second, let me put this back on screen. I was fixing that typo. So yeah, it clearly he's in a dunghill. Now, I went to Honduras several years ago, and I actually saw that it was common outside their city was the trash heap. And that's where people literally lived.
Yeah.
At the trash heap, because that's where they would find their food every day. As the new trash was brought from the nearby city, and I can't remember the name of the city that it was, but that the new daily trash dump brought some sort of food with it. And so people actually camped out and lived in the trash heap, in the trash, like right next to the big trash piles. They would have a little tent, or a little makeshift tent with some sticks and a piece of cloth, and it's just heartbreaking, right? Heartbreaking. And how the fact that they can live there and not supposedly die from some disease, right? Clearly, this guy's already got some sort of disease with the plague on his body, and he's just living at the trash. So if people think that this is just fanciful and just fancy words, no, I've seen this in real life. People actually can live at a trash heap. So, and to the point where like his wife is coming every day to bring him bread, which I think is, you know, it's sweet of her that she's going out to try to work. Some couple of things though I wanted to address, because we're already getting questions about it in the chat, which is totally normal, and I would expect people to ask about these things.
Yeah.
Right. So it tells us a story that he's in this trash heap, and he's going through these great maladies after what Satan did to him, and that he, in verse 6 through 10, he's talking about the worms. He's literally telling the worms, hey, go do something else. Like, whoever sent you over here to mess with me, go do something else. I think that's kind of funny that he's trying to like talk to the worms, like, stay off my sores. It's kind of funny. But in such a morbid way, it's funny. But verse 9,
he's saying, stay on my sores, don't leave.
Did I read that wrong? When it's off my body, I put it back. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay, I read that.
He's like,
wrong.
You're not getting off me. You come back here, little guy, until you're commanded. Like, I'm gonna take this all in, right? The full experience.
Yeah. I wonder. It's interesting. I wonder if they're actually helping him in some way,
cleaning his wounds. Yeah.
Yeah, possibly. But verse 9, he says, I endured for 7 years, sitting on a dunghill outside the city while being plague stricken. And I saw with my own eyes my longed for children carried by angels to heaven. What do you think this is talking about?
Wow, I was going to ask you. I don't know. I see, like, we have the parenthetical carried by angels to heaven put in there, which could indicate that it's an insertion by the translator, right? Trying to make some sort of a meaning to this kind of weird, out of context verse. Because, I mean, his children died a little bit while back, so you would assume that if, you know, they're being carried by the angels, first of all, they're not going to heaven. They're spirits, like all spirits of men. All people who die, their spirit goes to the Father above, and the soul descends into Sheol, and then we're accompanied by, from what I can tell, Sean, I don't know how accurate it is, but angels actually do accompany the righteous to the righteous side of Sheol. While they wait the resurrection, right? So
yeah.
So this statement is theologically not correct from what I can tell, but like I said, it's in parentheses, so we don't know if that's an insertion by the person that was translating this. But I don't know. I'm not sure what to do with this, to be honest.
Well, this is one of those moments where, unfortunately, because we're only covering 3 chapters today, we won't be able to get to it. But later on in the book, he mentions this again. And he actually talks about having seen already, just as his children are taken to heaven, so will he be taken to heaven and given a crown and sit in authority in heaven. And his friends are actually mad at him for saying this, because they're like, how dare you, one who's lost everything, who's humiliated, who's clearly in sin, because they take up the same mentality that Satan taunts his wife with, saying, well, if you didn't deserve it, you wouldn't have gotten all this misfortune. So his friends share in that type of preliminary judgment over Job, claiming like, oh, you're withholding sin, just confess, and how dare you claim that you've seen that you're seated in heaven with a crown on. Like, so we're going to get into those chapters later. I personally think, because this is the first mention of this is a vision he saw. And he kind of explains about that later, just as he saw himself being seated in heaven already in a vision that was shown to him. So it's almost like during these 7 years, the Father gave him some sense of encouragement to be like, look, because by the way, we're going to read later, his children aren't even buried yet. Like, they're still under the house, and they're under the house for that whole 7 years. And according to the testament of Job, his friends don't hear about what happened to him and show up until the end of the 7 years. So like, word travels slowly in ancient Edom. And
wow, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
So all I'm trying to say is, like, this is one of those things I personally was thrown on. Like, when I first read this, I was like, whoa, that absolutely is not what the theology of the resurrection is, or of what happens to your soul after you die. So why is this being said? But then this is a part of finding context. I read further on down. I was like, oh, he mentions it again, and he mentions himself already being seated in heaven. He's had a vision of what was promised to him, and this is where I think we're going to see at the very last chapter, his brother, who's actually supposedly writing this book for him, also mentions that he'll take part in the resurrection. So it's interesting. I think that this verse 10 is an actual vision of what he's talking about.
Okay, yeah.
Because the reason I say that is because in the very next verse, in addition to everything I just said, the additional reason of why I think that's because the very next verse, He says, "And my humbled wife, who'd been brought to her bridal chambers, such great lusciousness with the spearmen as bodyguards, I saw her do water carrier's work like a slave in the house of a common man in order to win some bread and bring it to me." So he's not talking about like the moment he sat down on a dunghill, he saw his children be taken by angels to heaven, and he saw his wife get a job for somebody else and do like this description in verse 11 is happening over time. Does that make sense? So like
Yeah,
this isn't
yeah.
like the day he sat down, like my wife wouldn't work for someone else. No, he's talking about he's giving you a summation. And I think that part of that 7 years he was shown a vision of what happens, of the promise that his sons would be okay. They would be taken to heaven by angels in the resurrection. That's
Yeah, no,
that's my take on it from the surrounding context.
yeah,
So
it's plausible. It's plausible. My guess was just that there's a possibility that this text might have been put in the wrong spot, because we know that, these old ancient manuscripts, they come fragmented sometimes, and the people that are translating this stuff and have to compile it and put it together, it's almost like a puzzle sometimes, right? We've seen
yeah,
that in Enoch, we've seen that in other books where you're just like, what? That seems random to throw that type of thing right in there, right? That's out of
right.
context. And that was my guess, especially with the parenthetical part there, where it was possible insertion by the translator to add some context to that verse. That whole
Mhm.
verse might not even belong there, but I don't know. But what you said makes sense too, man. Definitely. Okay, so what else we got here?
Is there anything else in this chapter? We got Satan disguising himself as someone again. That we see that
Yeah.
in other apocryphal texts, as well as I don't think we see that in the canon, do we?
No, no, I don't think we do.
I mean, because when
We
he presented himself,
Jasher,
yeah,
but
we see it in Jasher, but like when he shows up to Jesus, he doesn't. I mean, I don't think he introduces himself as anybody
no,
else.
just plainly shows up. The devil went
Yeah,
up to Jesus and brought him to, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I don't know about that, but I'm trying to see if there's anything else in here before we go to a commercial. Um, of course, there's the disgrace of his wife, having to cut off her hair, and as a result of this, she has an emotional reaction. And by the time she gets back with the bread to her husband, she's ticked off that she lost her hair. So
Yeah, I
she,
mean, because isn't that, correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, but isn't that one of those instructions in Torah that women aren't to shave their heads?
right,
So that's like, assuming, and we do believe that these patriarchs and people like Job were righteous in the sense that they followed Torah,
right.
at least the instructions they had up to that point. Um, yeah, and it could have been one of them, and just knowing that she's possibly doing something against Torah, but just to keep them alive, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
That just adds that much more insult to the situation.
Right. And I'm pretty sure that the priests of Baal shave their heads. So it was kind of like it was definitely, if anyone's out there that has any hair loss and you decide to shave your head, we're not saying you're in some
Yeah,
great transgression, guys. I just want to make that clear. I'm just saying, like, this is clearly a moment where the devil is trying to humiliate Job's wife,
yeah,
because as all men know, if your wife is unhappy with you, your life is even worse. So not only,
yeah.
not only is Job sitting in a dunghill with worms on him and lost everything he has and is disgraced and humiliated, now his wife is ticked off. So like, and she brings that rage back to him to the dunghill.
Yeah.
Like just adding manure to their crappy home already.
I feel for her though, Sean. I mean, if you think about everything that she's had to endure as well, right, with all of this, and like you said, who knows what kind of conversations transpired over this time period, right? Did Job
Mhm.
tell her, something bad's happening because I just
Yeah.
destroyed that temple? Did they communicate in a way where she was ready for it as well, or was this all coming on as a surprise? It's
Yeah.
interesting to think about.
And of course, he's behind her in verse 24 here, as she goes back home. So like it's like Satan wants to revel in seeing the discourse, the strife that's about to happen.
Yeah.
And he could be prompting her to have these emotions and get mad at her brother. We have some good discussion in the chat.
Yeah, I was just looking. I was just looking at it. Like
Yeah.
Eric Rice has said a couple
Yeah,
great things.
he's
Yeah.
talking about Satan from what we just read, chapter 4 and 5. He's in the business of misery. Robert Daniels, 100% agree with you, brother. I don't think Job's wife signed up for that either. So she's definitely struggling with her own character decisions and being supportive of this guy. And, I actually have to backtrack on my opinions of Job's wife, because when I read the canonized text, it seems like it doesn't say that Job is at a 7-year point. where he's been sitting in this dunghill because he's plague ridden. And by the way, if people don't realize, the reason he'd be sitting in this dunghill outside the city is because he's plague ridden, so he couldn't be inside the city. So he's in quarantine, right? But what's interesting is I don't know how long this plague lasts, and I don't know, like, in typically plague, when someone's experiencing this type of stuff, these outbreaks of sores and things, I don't know how long, if that was supposed to clear up, if there was supposed to be an ointment involved. I don't know if 7 years is the average time or if it's a short amount of time or long. So the point is, for a wife who has to go now get a job, someone that lived in utter luxury as a queen and now has to go get a job, literally working for a day's bread, which means you're not profiting at all, guys. Like, you're a slave, straight up slave, and you're just having to. And now she's had that source of 2 loaves of bread cut down to 1. So now she's like sharing 1 loaf of bread with Job instead of him having his own loaf, and she's being squeezed emotionally to being like, I can't take this anymore. And then she loses her hair, and so, like, I thought from the canon, I thought she was just a horrible wife and was unsupported from the get-go, but it seems like she's been supported for like 7 years.
Yeah, and I agree 100%, Sean. She seems like a pretty awesome wife based off of what she's endured. But as we continue on, and like in this next chapter here, we're going to see that there's a little parallel that I'm going to pair up with the Septuagint version in Job that highlights the fact that, she was someone who was a servant during this time doing some of these things, where we don't get that in the Masoretic text. So as you said, like, we just don't get the details on Job's wife in the Masoretic text. So you could just, you read it in its short little snippets that they do provide in that version, and you're thinking, oh man, she was just, she was a bad wife, right? And we don't get the 7 years told to us in the book of Job. We assume it's a long time, but we don't know, right? It's kind of like Jubilees. It reminds me of Jubilees, right? Where it says how long Adam and Eve were in the garden before they actually sinned.
Yeah, 7 years.
Yeah, interesting time.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Which makes so much sense, by the way. makes so much sense to this idea of them, like, anyway, because people always try to figure out, like, what was it like for Adam and Eve in there, and how people would say, because some people would think that, like, literally the day they're created, Satan came up and tempted them, and you're like, well, do you think, all right, well, if Yahweh created a fully grown man and woman in fully grown bodies that don't grow anymore, then what is he teaching them? Like, how much knowledge some people, I've heard people say that, like, Adam just had the fullness of the knowledge of angels, like, the moment he was created. And I'm like, no, Jubilee says that the angels taught Adam how to live.
Yeah.
So that's like, they had to be little parents to Adam and Eve and teaching them what's right and what's wrong and how to live in the garden and not get kicked out. So that makes so much more sense than just like, boom, you're in the garden. Yeah,
exactly. I agree. And then I think it's Sirach or the Wisdom of Solomon, where it talks about how Satan through his envy of mankind.
Wisdom of Solomon 2:24.
Yeah. So that envy that Satan possessed, he wasn't created, right? We don't believe that Yahweh created an antagonist, right? Just like he was an angel that was supposed to be glorifying the Father, just like his brethren. And over time, according to Jubilees, it could have taken up to 7 years for him to see, just like have that envy boiling towards them. Yeah. Right. So I mean, that timeline makes more sense to me than just like instant hatred towards them, instantly sinning in the garden. Like, yeah.
I agree, brother. All right. You want this next one?
Yeah, I can read it. All right. And immediately my wife came near me, and crying aloud and weeping, she said, Job, Job, how long will you sit upon the dunghill outside of the city, pondering yet for a while and expecting to obtain your hoped for salvation? And I have been wandering from place to place, roaming about as a hired servant. Behold, their memory has already died away from the earth. And my sons and the daughters that I carried on my bosom, and the labors and pains that I sustained, have been for nothing. And you sit in the malodorous state of soreness and worms, passing the nights in the cold air. And I have undergone all trials and troubles and pains, day and night, until I succeeded in bringing bread to you. For your surplus of bread is no longer allowed to me. And as I can scarcely take my own food and divide it between us, I pondered in my heart that it was not right that you should be in pain and hunger for bread. And so that's, I mean, Shagan, that's pretty amazing.
Pretty loving. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I ventured to go to the market without bashfulness. And when the bread seller told me, give me money and you shall have bread, I disclosed to him our state of distress. Then I heard him say, if you have no money, hand me the hair of your head and take 3 loaves of bread in order that you may live on these for 3 days.
Sorry, hey, it's trying to change.
That's all good. And I yielded to the wrong and said to him, rise and cut off my hair. And he rose in a disgrace, cut off with the scissors the hair of my head on the marketplace, while the crowd stood by and wondered. Who would then not be astonished, saying, is this Sittis, the wife of Job, who had 14 curtains to cover her inner sitting room, and doors within doors, so that he was greatly honored who would be brought near her? And now behold, she bars off her hair for bread? Who had camels laden with goods, and they were brought into remote lands to the poor, and now she sells her hair for bread? Behold, her who had 7 tables immovably set in her house, at which each poor man and each stranger ate, and now she sells her hair for bread. Behold, her who had the basin wherewith to wash her feet made of gold and silver, and now she walks upon the ground and sells her hair for bread. Behold, her who had garments made of byssus interwoven with gold, and now she exchanges her hair for bread. Behold, her who had couches of gold and of silver, and now she sells her hair for bread. In short, then, Job, after the many things that have been said to me, I now say in one word to you, since the feebleness of my heart has crushed my bones. Rise then, and take these loaves of bread and enjoy them, and then speak some word against the Lord and die. For I too would exchange the lethargy of death for the sustenance of my body. But I replied to her, behold, I have been for these 7 years plague-stricken, and I have stood the worms of my body, and I was not weighed down in my soul by all these pains. And as to the word which you say, speak some word against God and die, together with you, I will endure the evil which you see, and let us endure the ruin of all that we have. Yet you desire that we should say some word against God, and that he should be exchanged for the great Pluto, the god of the netherworld. Why do you not remember those great goods which we possessed? If these goods came from the lands of the Lord, should not we also endure evils, and be high-minded in everything until the Lord will have mercy again and show pity to us? Do you not see the seducer stand behind you and confound your thoughts in order that you should beguile me? And he turned to Satan and said, why do you not come openly to me? Stop hiding yourself, you wretched one. Does the lion show his strength in the weasel cage, or does the bird fly in the basket? I now tell you, go away and wage your war against me. Then he went off from behind my wife and placed himself before me, crying. And he said, behold, Job, I yield and give way to you who are but flesh, while I am a spirit. You are plague-stricken, but I am in great trouble. For I am like a wrestler contesting with a wrestler who has, in single-handed combat, torn down his antagonist and covered him with dust and broken every limb of his, whereas the other one who lies beneath, having displayed his bravery, gives forth sounds of triumph, testifying to his own superior excellence. Thus you, O Job, are beneath and stricken with plague and pain, and yet you have carried the victory in the wrestling match with me. And behold, I yield to you. Then he left me abashed. Now, my children, you also show a firm heart in all the evil that happens to you. For greater than all things is firmness of heart.
Amen.
So that last verse, just so people are aware, this is Job essentially in his bed telling his new children, his deathbed rather, his new children, what all went on in his life during this particular time period. So just in case you forgot that's kind of like the context of the story here. But
yeah, if this was the Princess Bride, this would be the moment where the camera would go back to the bedroom with Fred Savage and the grandpa reading the book. So there's so much in this chapter. So we got 20 minutes maybe. So let's see if we can surmise this real quick, but summarize this, I should say. But what do you want to start with? It's so much to talk about.
So for me, Sean, like I was saying just before reading this chapter, it's interesting that a lot of what is spoken about here we can find in Job chapter 2, right? I'm just going to read Job chapter 2 verse 9 in the Septuagint version, okay? Because Job chapter 2 verse 9 in the Masoretic text, all it says is this: then his wife said to him, I'll let you pull that up. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold firm your integrity? Curse God and die. That's all we get, okay?
Right.
So if we go to the Septuagint version, we get a little bit more context that actually lines up with exactly what we see here in the Testament of Job. And it says, and when much time had passed, his wife said to him, how long will you hold out, saying, behold, I will wait yet a little while, expecting the hope of my deliverance, or salvation, as the Testament of Job said. For behold, your memorial is abolished from the earth, even your sons and daughters, the pangs and pains of my womb, which I bore in vain, my sorrows. And you yourself sit down to spend the nights in the open air among the corruption of worms. And I am a wanderer. This is what I want to highlight here. And I am a wanderer and a servant from place to place and house to house, waiting for the setting of the sun, that I may rest from my labors and my pangs which now beset me. So that's what we see here, right? She exactly what we see in the Septuagint version of chapter 2, verse 9. Right. She was a servant. She went from house to house. She was just trying to live, right? She was, trying to provide enough sustenance for Job and herself to just make it to the next day, essentially, right? Whereas the Masoretic text makes it seem like she was just, now she's just back in the picture and like, curse God and die. What are you doing? Like, that's just not what we see here at all in this story, right?
Yeah, there's so much more to their psyche, what they're going through. Yeah, I agree with you. This is important information. And it validates this idea that there was time that had passed, because even in the Septuagint, it's talking about she's a server, a wanderer, and a servant from place to place. It doesn't. You don't get that kind of time qualifier brought to mind from the Masoretic text, because you just think this is all happening in like within a week.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to me, that just lends credence to the legitimacy of this text, right? Whether it's got some minor manuscript issues or not. I mean, this story lines up and validates what the Septuagint says about her, right? And other areas as well of that book. But yeah.
And so we got someone in the chat today. Robert's asking, how do we know the expanded version is true? And I'm guessing that he's referring to the Septuagint, because we keep referencing back. And brother Robert, if you're first time seeing our show, I want to encourage you to go back to previous episodes. We did 2 full episodes on all the similarities and differences between the Masoretic text of Job and the Septuagint text of Job. And we break down what the Septuagint is, some of its history, to give you an idea of how it was written about 1100 years before the most common Masoretic translation, and who wrote them. And that's the most important part. So go check those episodes out. We've already done all that discussion and scholarship for you to glean off of and bring to the table of this conversation here as well.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, it'll help you out for sure.
What's interesting here real quick is there's a moment, I think it's in verse this is so she's, well,
we get her name too.
Yeah, we get her name, Sidis. And at the bystanders that are watching her get her hair chopped off, they say, is not this the woman whom had all this wealth and this amazing sitting room and these tables set up in her house for poor people and the strangers ate, and that they were brought, all the camels laden with goods brought the goods to the remote lands to the poor. So this is just, again, even the people standing by knew the truth about Job and his wife Sidis versus Satan's lie to the marauders that he got to come and attack Job, So it's almost like that's why he had to go. Does it say where he got the band of marauders? Because he disguised himself as a king of Persia, but does that mean he got the marauders from Persia?
That's my assumption, is that he used whatever the Persian army was back in that time period to go and invade, I guess, and do everything.
Which would make sense in my understanding of why he could get away with lying to them, and them being so far away from Edom, not have really known who Job and his wife were, how they were so good to people and so generous and charitable. You know what I'm saying? For that lie to actually be believed and create his own little band of marauders. So that's just something, little things that I seem to make sense to me in a way, that little stuff like that would work. But everyone knew who these people were, that they were. What's interesting, he just says in the Septuagint translation, talks about your memorial is gone. And it also says that here in talks about the children. No one remembers your children. Yeah, verse 2. And I've been wandering from place to place, roaming about as a hired servant. Behold, their memory has already died away from the earth. So she's like, this made me, I thought of this verse when you're reading the Septuagint, where it talks about Job's memorial was gone, right? So meaning like people didn't even remember who this dude was anymore. It's 7 years past. He's sitting outside the city, plague ridden in a dunghill. Whatever awesome thoughts people used to have about these people, about Job and his wife, all that's gone. People don't even remember that they're not respectfully mourning their children anymore, or that the passing of their children, nothing that. There's no honor given to Job or his family in any regard. He
Yeah.
is a bygone relic that has lost favor with the culture and society around him. And just imagine that mindset of like, I don't know how long he was a king before this and how, I think it's going to tell us at the end. I just can't remember the numbers, but clearly he enjoyed an immense amount of respect from everybody. This is what we read in Job chapter 29 in the Masoretic, that the elders at the gate and the young men would not even look him in the eye and would be fearful of him because of his righteous judgment and his righteous character. And so I think it's fascinating, like all that appeal and all that respect gone, and his wife, that seems to be a thing for her. That seems to matter to her in both Septuagint and in the Testament of Job. This idea of what people thought of them is something that she brings up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's, I don't know, just a perspective of like her heart versus his heart, you know? Because he's like, hey, I'm just here enduring regardless of my sores and the worms. I continue not to, what does he say later? Like, my attitude didn't change. Is that what he says?
Yeah, right at the bottom there. He's just
yeah, I've stood the worms. I've not weighed down my soul by all these pains. Yeah.
Yeah, because he knows, like you said earlier, he knows that the outcome of this trial is going to be, it's going to reap him something even better, right? And that there's, and even not even just physically, but as we know in this book, as well as in Job, in the canon,
yeah,
he knows that there's a spiritual outcome to this, right? Where he's going to take on a resurrection. So he's got everything in its right perspective. And in context, whereas it seems like his wife is missing some pieces, although it's crazy, like we just read, she was an amazing wife from what I can tell, and I understand why she got to her boiling point.
Yeah. She broke finally, and he's kind of like addressing that. He's like, look, I'm the one with pain on my body and sores and everything and worms, and I haven't weighed down my soul.
Yeah, exactly.
So he's kind of like, he's saying, look, you know, because she says this unique statement in verse 18, which I think is kind of catty. All right. You know, love and respect all the women out there. I love you, sweetie. My wife's probably watching. But I think that verse 18 is interesting because she says this, for I too would exchange the lethargy of death for the sustenance of my body, because she's like making fun of his incredibly pious and humble attitude of like, I'm here enduring this and not going out and procuring food because he can't, which I think is fascinating in this culture, how literally we see this today where they're trying to restrict people who are considered COVID super spreading non-VAXX, like, you know, they consider that a biological threat. And so therefore they're trying to restrict people from normal life, including buying food at the grocery store in Australia. So like, this is the same concept. This dude can't go into town and get food. His wife has to do it for him. And so therefore she's like almost not mocking, but just like almost trying to turn it on its head. This idea of like, I would trade positions with you if I could, you know. Yeah. She's trying to say, look, I'm noble too, but she's also saying I've hit my breaking point.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then he tries to remind her in verse 21, verse 20, he tries to remind her, just sit down and endure this with me. Because he knows he has to get through this, because that's what the angel told him. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's amazing. What else we got here? I mean, other than, it's super interesting the fact that Job, through all this, he can tell who the adversary is, even in his cunning, you know, transformation of body that he does a few times in this book. He knows who the adversary is, right? And he's just like the guy lurking in the shadows in the background there behind the bushes, watching the interaction between Job and his wife. And, you know, how's this going to turn out? Is she going to, like, you know, is she going to say something to the point where he will actually curse God and die, and I'm going to win this little wrestling match that I've, you know, taken on with Job? And Job's just like, hey, you get over here. Why are you hiding? Like, why are you transforming yourself? I just want to be Job's wife in that moment. Be like, what? You're Satan? You're the guy that I lost my beautiful locks to here for this bread? It's interesting, just the spiritual discernment between the two, right? That Job's just like, he knows. She doesn't. She obviously knows now. But he's just like, dude.
And she's not asking, why is this dude that took my hair follow me to the dunghill?
Yeah, why you want to give me more bread? Is that where you follow me? Like 3, come on. But it's interesting. I mean, Job's just like, come plainly to me, be a man, quote unquote, right? And just Satan's response to this is so childish. It's so like, I've been trying so hard to do this, and I've broken your body and blah 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 blah, and like you're the victor here, and this sucks. And he's just like complaining about it. It just shows an interesting side to this adversary that we all in this Christian faith of ours don't get to see that person to person perspective that he has, right? He is an angel, right? He's not just this concept, evil concept, right? He's not just like the machinations of men's evil in their hearts, and it's just taken on a character named Satan, but he's an actual character. He's physical. He's a spirit. He says, I'm a spirit, right?
Yeah. He's got his own personality. He's got his own desires. He's got his own emotions, which I think he's extremely, he needs a lot of counseling from the Father. I think his emotional state has decayed into insanity and madness, but he does have his own, just like angels and mankind. They have that same psychological capacity for failure and victory and emotion and passion, and so clearly he's deceived himself. And it is an interesting reaction to him, especially as he uses the metaphor of two athletes wrestling, because that's what the angel said to Job. The good angel said to Job in the beginning of how you're going to endure
wrestle
like an athlete. And so I think that's unique, that there's a callback there from chapter 1. And then also the fact that Satan in the metaphor makes himself the one holding Job on the ground, saying, I beat you, but yet
tap
on the ground. Right. Yeah, exactly. Job's just shouting triumphantly, I've won. If that won't preach, guys, I don't know what else does. That is your typical charismatic, inspirational preaching message right there, of no matter what Satan's trying to do to you, to remember who has the victory through Yeshua, through Jesus Christ, right? Because of what Christ did for you, you will now be raised and made higher than the angels at the resurrection. You have the victory. So even though you might not feel it in the moments, when the Father has a promise for you, better than for the enemy, better for the bad angel. So that's fascinating that he seems to have that mindset, and we're going to hear him verbalize that mindset to his friends and later on in the chapters for next week. So
amen, man. And it's so cool because Satan ends up yielding to Job and takes off, right? And it just, to me, it's like James 4:7, right? Submit yourselves to Yahweh and resist the devil, and he will flee from you, right? And it's just, I don't know, this is so cool. I love
it.
Do
you think that the devil fled at this point because he knew the 7 years was coming to an end?
I think he fled in the moment just because he realized that this guy likely will not, he's not going to give up in this moment. So he fled that area. Obviously, we know he comes back and does certain things, but
because this is like the second time he tells him to get out of here. The first time was earlier, I think in chapter 4 or 5.
When he's dressed up as the old man. Whatever.
He's like, just get out of here and wage your war against me. Just stop trolling me and go do what you want to do. So it's interesting that he tells him multiple times to leave. Same thing with in the first few chapters where he comes to his house acting like he needs bread, acting like he's a hungry beggar. But he's not.
It's just ironic too that he's asking for bread. Job gives him a burnt piece of bread, and then he ends up giving bread to his wife, right?
And then and then Satan ends up burning his livelihood, his food. His cattle and stock and sheep and everything. So it's interesting. There's so much. Now I've got to address this because I know people are going to be asking about this. Verse 21. Yet you desire that we should say some word against God. This is Job talking to his wife. And that he should be exchanged for the great Pluto, the god of the netherworld. Now I feel confident in what I think that he's saying in this verse. It's weird. It's worded weird in the English, but what do you think what's being transmitted here from Job to his wife?
Residence, locality. I think that he's referring to, if we curse God and die, then our physical bodies will die. Our soul will descend into Sheol, right? Or Hades in the Greek. And where Pluto, right? Where Pluto resides, where this Hades character resides. And that's where we're going to be, essentially. Not in terms of like their salvation. They're not going to receive the resurrection or anything, but
Yeah.
That's how I understand it. Like let's just get down there, right, and go to his domain type thing.
Well, my thoughts are formed from my research, and I just did a video on Pluto, which is Hades to the Greeks, and it's fascinating because while I was doing my research and like, okay, so let me just put it like this: everything that I've been talking about in my Investigating Babylon series and all the different characters I'm mentioning, like you and I have been talking about this stuff for years in some facet or another. So like, I appreciate you not giving away the spoilers because you know that the end of the series.
Yeah.
But all the little details, some of those things I've been researching in the last year and adding to for the presentation's sake, just to pile on all this extra validation for all the naysayers that might watch that video and knee jerk. Right. So I bring all that. That's why they're sometimes so long. I'm bringing lots of extra validation. I could just come out in 5 minutes and say, it's this guy, the second beast is this guy. I know his name. And then just let people stew in the comments. But instead, I try to be loving and I try to be a thorough sound teacher and just give you a ton of extra evidentiary evidence there to see what I'm talking about. Some of the things I read about Hades, also called Pluto by the Romans, is that people would not want to speak his name because they didn't want to say anything bad or good about him because they thought in doing so that they would dishonor him and that he would come after them and kill them. So when his wife says to him, curse God and die, he's then saying, in my understanding, he's saying, should we treat Yahweh like people treat Pluto? Because because the common fear is that if you curse Pluto, he's going to come kill you and bring you to the underworld. So therefore he's like, that's in context with verse 20 of her shouting at him, just curse God and die. He's like, I'm not going to treat Yahweh like people treat Pluto. Like Yahweh wouldn't do that anyway. That's not how Yahweh, you know what I'm saying? So like, because you could repent after you had this outburst against Yahweh, and Yahweh might, you know what I'm saying? But in their minds of how they worship these false gods, which I think it's appropriate. The translator in this passage, he called it a little g god of the netherworld, because they believe that if you said anything against Pluto, he would come kill you and take you to the underworld. So then they didn't want to speak his name. And when they went and offered sacrifices at his temples, they didn't look up at his idol, would make eye contact because they were so afraid of him. He was the god of death. So, which the Egyptians called Anubis, and we see as Nergal in the Old Testament.
Nergal, I know that's been a word that I've been throwing around the last couple of days since I watched that. Jess and I watched that when we were on our little trip there. We threw that on, and it's like, Nergal, really? The second beast is Nergal?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's a weird name. So that's my understanding of why he would say that, because that's literally the process that she's trying to ask Yahweh. She's trying to make him invoke of Yahweh that the surrounding nations believed would happen if you did that to Pluto.
That makes sense. That's a lot of sense there, Sean. Yeah. That would make sense to me.
Anything else in this chapter that you thought you want to talk about? What do you think it means that Satan says he's in great trouble in verse 27?
Like, you're probably referring to like what we see in First Enoch. I think it's in First Enoch. Like, you're plague stricken, but I'm in, like, he knows the end of his line too, right? It's just like he knows that he's going to be erased from this game as well. So it's
that would drive you to madness as well.
Oh yeah.
Knowing that judgment is coming. It's like when you're a kid and your mom was like, when your dad gets home, he's going to beat your butt with the belt. And then you're in your room stewing for 4 hours, knowing that you can't even enjoy your playtime. You can't enjoy your cartoons because you're just, the wrath is coming when you get home, when he gets home. So like, I could see that. Yeah. Interesting.
It's really interesting to think about if you were Satan. Like, I think, like, not that I'm telling people to do this, but it's really an interesting little thought, to pretend that you're this seducer, this antagonist, and be like, that you're eventually, it's been proclaimed that you are going to be judged and thrown into the lake of fire, and you're gone, right? So it's like, do you try to wreak as much havoc until that point, or do you just be the persistent widow and go and be like, I'm sorry, forgive me, please. Like, I'll change my ways. Like, I'll show you I can be a better angel, right? I can do this. I made a big mistake, right? what do you do knowing that proclamation has come across for that's your judgment? You're gone. And wouldn't you too try to destroy as much as possible?
Right. You're going out in a blaze of glory. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause you're just going out with fury and anger. Cause you're like, and this is what I can't, I can't take every conversation we have and in these appropriate little moments and clip it for my new series. But that sentiment, what you're talking about, I'm going to be addressing in part 20 of my series, because I will be focusing on Satan, the dragon's lair, and what happens to him, and the history and the interaction we see. And so it seems to be like in Revelation 12, where it says, "Woe to the earth and the inhabitants of the earth, for Satan has come down to you, and he's full of fury and wrath." It seems to be like that mentality you're mentioning just kind of escalates to the point where Yeshua's about to come back, and he just starts going full bore on humanity, which gets him locked up for 1,000 years. Versus what we talked about earlier, which is, if he's literally the one burning up the cattle, and he's literally the one, and you said he got permission to do it, and that's probably a better answer than my idea was just, is he tricking other people to do his dirty work for him, which he seems to do in other parts of the Bible. He tricks people to do his dirty work for him, versus Revelation time, where he just physically gets involved, and then he has to be locked up because he's gone too far. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That seems to me why we see that escalation and ferocity towards mankind, where he's no longer playing puppet master. Now he's just getting in the game himself, and he's going to suffer the consequences when Yeshua arrives. So that's my thought. There's a lot to it, but
yeah, no, it's great. And I'm looking forward to the latter end of that Babylon series for sure, man. It's good. Very, very good series.
Watch me lose all my subscribers in a single episode.
No way. That's if we had something like a lighthouse and that video was uploaded to a lighthouse, that thing would skyrocket in the algorithms.
Probably, maybe. I don't
know.
That
whole series should be skyrocketing, in my opinion. I think it's probably suppressed, but yeah, good stuff, man. This was a good episode. I enjoyed it. This is an interesting book. I'm going to be transparent. I'm not a thumbs up or thumbs down yet. This is kind of like live action. We're going through this book, and
I'll reserve judgment too. Yeah.
Yeah. So
there's some things in here that I'm encouraged by. There's some things in here that we have seen that do line up with the canonical testament of Job. Excuse me, the canonical book of Job. But there are some things that raise an eyebrow, and you would, like we've shown you today, that means you'd have to look into, we'd have to find like validation for, did a translator make that insertion, or, and that is where Ken and I are a little bit limited in the availability of some of the manuscript history and chain of custody from translator, from archaeological finding to which church had it throughout the last 700 years versus which guy decided to go and translate it in the 1800s. You know what I mean? So like Ken and I are a little bit limited on what we can actually research from our prospective homes.
Right.
So we're doing our best, guys. And our biggest thing is like, does it line up theologically? And if it does, just like we've talked about in the canon of 66, that there are some books where the numbers are not the same. And people struggle with that, and atheists love to use that as fodder for their arguments. But we have to remember that scribal errors happen. Like, it's a well-known thing in all of academia where literature is being copied and translated throughout time. People make mistakes. So
yeah, and not just that, but there's also like nefarious groups of individuals who've had their hands on these manuscripts for many, many years that decided to scissor certain things and add things and just to throw it off. And we have like witnesses of people, calling them out on it, right? We have historical manuscripts that are saying that they were doing this type of stuff to books. So
yeah, we reviewed that in our Ascension of Isaiah episodes, and we talked about Origen's quote where he's calling out the religious leaders of his day, the rabbis, how they were intentionally inserting things into some of these books so that people would discredit them. So we're just doing our best to weed through it, guys, but we're going to pick up probably the next 3 chapters in the following episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, my brother. I appreciate you and your commentary. It's always a pleasure to do this with you. And thank you, brothers and sisters, for joining us this evening. We really do appreciate it. And if you don't mind hitting that thumbs up button or thumbs down, whatever, I'm not going to force anything on you, right? Whatever you feel is necessary, please do so.
I'll tell you to hit that thumbs up. Hit that thumbs up. Share it, like it. Bring us a comment in the comment section. Tell us if you're enjoying what we're doing or not. And we just appreciate everybody watching and supporting us. It's great.
Bye.